Hey, everybody. I'm Dave Merkel, CEO and one of the co-founders of Expel. And with me today is Jeff Pollard, Forrester Analyst, actually, I believe, VP and Principal Analyst, if I'm using the proper title, and lead author of the Forrester Wave for the Managed Detection and Response sector. And I think the latest was published in Q2 of this year, 2023. Obviously, Expel, we're an MDR provider, we're in there. Jeff and I have had an opportunity to talk a lot about our universe and all the things I'm doing wrong. And so
yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me. Yeah,
and
right. That's right. Yeah.
But Jeff, here, I'll chat. You've been at this and just have a tremendous background. Why don't I just turn it over to you to talk a little bit about that, and we can get into some Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Dave mentioned, Jeff Pollard here, Vice President, Principal Analyst on the Security Risk team at Forrester. I've been here for about 7.5 years. I lead our global security services coverage, which includes managed detection and response and a bunch of other topics. And as mentioned, published the most recent Forrester MDR wave in Q2 of 2023, which, as always, is one of my favorite waves that I get a chance to do. I've done 13, and this one, like the one from 2021, remains one of my favorites just based on kind of the sort of quality of the market space, the nature of the clients and how informed they are, the use cases, and that sort of thing. So happy to be here and super excited to dive into it in more detail.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Jeff. I too love the wave. I wish we could fill out the requested package of materials monthly. It's
I'm sure the rest of your teams do too. So I'm sure they appreciate that massive questionnaire they get.
That may be them quitting.
Yeah, exactly. It could be.
Oh, and in all seriousness, it is actually very thoughtful, which is why it does take all that much effort. We couldn't do it monthly because it's definitely comprehensive. All right, cool. Well, why don't we start off a little bit with talking a bit about the MDR market, some things that buyers need to consider, and maybe I'll give you just sort of a broad question, so you can kind of take this wherever you would like. Give us sort of just an overview of the MDR market, a brief one. And a little bit about, okay, well, how are MDR organizations, or how are MDR vendors helping organizations? There we go. Let's talk about it that way. And what you see as the value that they're primarily delivering.
Yeah. So I think to summarize the market, I would say that it's a successful market. It's still a growing market. It's definitely established, but it is also saturated, I think, to some extent. There are tons of MDR vendors. Now, there's still a lot of MDR opportunity out there. It's still a growing space, but there are a lot of providers out there that offer MDR, some that offer it directly, some that offer it via partnerships, some that have technology requirements that not all customers might meet. So it can be a very difficult market for organizations to navigate because, when you hear all of the things that MDR providers offer, it can sometimes be very difficult to sort of differentiate between them. So it's a packed market, but it's a super successful market. The thing that I like most about MDR, and the thing that security leaders that work with MDR providers like most, is that it is a service that actually does things for you. If you go back to especially the old days of MSSPs, for example, they were often alert factories. You sent them logs, they sent you back alerts, everything said reload the box, pave and kind of reimage. And it was sort of like getting a homework assignment all the time. It didn't actually resolve things for you. What's really been amazing about the MDR market is really that R piece, right? It's that respond part, because it's actually working with a provider that collaboratively can bring you expertise on the threat actor, expertise on the right response actions, expertise on the methodologies to investigate and respond to things. And so that's been a big part. Detection, of course, is still important, but the response part of actually following something through and closing it out is really where I find most customers being, most excited about their MDR provider and what they're looking for. There are a lot of different approaches to MDR, though. There are, SaaS platforms that offer more of a, SaaS-oriented kind of approach to MDR. There are some that are, technology companies that attach MDR to their existing security portfolio of solutions, maybe an EDR agent, something like that. There are, traditional consulting firms or firms that primarily offer incident response that, have kind of pivoted into offering managed detection and response as well. And then there are even, VARs and SIs and integrators out there that are in the ecosystem that now also offer MDR. So there's an abundance of choice out there, which becomes part of my job to sort of sort through and select the ones that we think are most relevant from a research perspective. And in this case, in the Wave, we had 13 providers, of course, Expel included. But the big thing that I find out there that's true for the most successful MDR providers is that they have a clear perspective and philosophy on what they're doing. So they absolutely have a mindset of how they want to deliver services. They have an approach and a philosophy to it. And often what I'd say is kind of a mission-oriented culture. They really look at MDR as something that they've chosen to do, that they want to do well. And those are a couple of the characteristics I find that do separate out some providers from others in particular.
Okay. So if I'm a security leader, I'm a CISO or senior leader in a security team, and I'm trying to think about, okay, do I need this, and then what do I need? You talked about there being a number of different shapes, which has also been my experience. It's definitely a market that's a bit of a chimera in terms of approaches. Do you have like a short number of questions someone might want to ask themselves, or things they want to think about as they start that process? And I'm sure there's 27 questions they could ask, but if there's like a 3 or 4 litmus test, okay, should I be thinking about this? Is there some kind of abbreviated framework that someone could potentially use?
Yeah, and it's one I use on virtually every call I do, as a matter of fact. So the first sort of branching off point I find for someone interested in MDR that might think about using it is, do you want MDR, or do you need something else that might be marketed as MDR but may not be? And the big example there is for someone that needs technology managed, especially security technology managed. Again, thinking back to the old world of MSS, for example, I still on occasion find organizations that need someone to manage a firewall. That's not really MDR, right? That's not what MDR is good at. I don't want MDR vendors to manage firewalls. And I think most security folks don't necessarily want MDR vendors to manage firewalls, right? That's kind of a legacy thing. So one of those branching off points is, do you need a technology solution managed like firewalls? SIEM is a little different because sometimes helping a customer out with some SIEM use cases is actually kind of valid for an MDR provider, right? From a detection engineering perspective, maybe not fully managing a SIEM, but certainly integrating and operating with it. So that's one of the first questions is, is this really a detection and response set of use cases? Are you looking for someone that can help you find things, investigate things, and respond to things? And those things primarily being threats, whether that's an external adversary or maybe even an insider risk, right? Those two things are valid. So that's kind of, first and foremost part of what they're looking for. It is identifying that portion. And then the next part is really kind of talking them through the use cases, especially around how they want the service delivered. Are you looking for 24/7? Are you looking for someone that will augment your existing team? Are you looking for someone that might only do it, on the off hours? Are you looking for a provider that can help educate your team? One of the things that I find a lot of security teams doing now is that in the olden days, right, when we, walked uphill to the sock both ways, we had this mindset where like we had a product or a service, and the service was its own thing. It was kind of a Ronco set it and forget it special, if that reference doesn't date things even more. And now what I find is that for a lot of security leaders, that sort of bias of we can either build it ourselves or we can buy it as a service doesn't exist now. Instead, the real structure and nature of delivery is much more collaborative and educational. Mm-hmm. It's often a situation where a security leader knows that they can hire people, they can train people, but there's a limit on the amount of time they're going to keep that talent. 1 year, 2 years, something like that. Whereas as a security vendor, you often will retain talent for a lot longer than that. So they're looking for someone that can help bridge that gap. So instead of them having someone for 2 years that leaves and takes a few friends with them, and all of a sudden your average tenure goes from 12 months to 18 months down to 3 months, you're looking for a provider to partner with that can offer more stability there, where even if your team leaves, they plug in and keep that average level of expertise, maybe not tenure, but that average level of expertise much higher than it is when your team might, leave together or en masse as a security leader. So that's the other part of it, is really figuring out, are you looking for someone where you can kind of set it and forget this, where they're just going to tell you that something happened and take care of it? Or are you looking for a provider that is comfortable and able to help upskill your team, especially when they're newer, because they're more comfortable with a collaborative approach to delivery, because some organizations don't want as much interaction. I find most, especially most I talk to at Forrester, do want more of that collaboration because they tend to be a little bit larger, a little bit more sophisticated.
Yeah, and another, I'll try a statement, see if you agree. It also seems like it's not fixed at a point in time. So it may be now, dial it to a 1, now put it on a 5.5. Now please dial it to 11. So it's not even a switch. It's sort of a sliding scale, or at least it seems to be something that we run into quite a bit.
There's definitely a continuum where some of that's, if something is urgent enough, if it's enough of a crisis, if they have other complexities going on internally where they need almost more of kind of a surge of, hey, normally I don't need this level of hand-holding or support, but because of these other 11 things, I actually do need that right now. And so I want more engagement. I want more collaboration. That definitely happens. And that's one of the advantages of, kind of a quality partner that will allow you to work with them in the way that you want to work with them, not in the way that they dictate you have to work with them, which again is sort of the old model of how we approach security services. It was much more sort of rigid. I find MDR in general is quite a bit more adaptable to what a customer needs and wants out of it.
Okay, makes sense. All right, well, why don't we let's pivot a little bit here and talk a little bit about the role of MDR in security operations. You've talked a little bit about that now as you kind of got into that collaboration theme, and maybe a little bit of prognostication on the future. So this one's always my favorite. So if there are, by which I mean, good Lord, can we please not have as many acronyms? Here we go. So there's a lot of terms, right, that float around in the managed security services space: MDR, XDR, co-managed SIM. Obviously, legacy MSSP you don't hear about as often, but it's there. You hear SOC as a service, whatever that term means. How are you thinking about that kind of, frankly, mess? And how do you think about MDR as either part of the mess or something that you think is starting to pull some mind share and create some gravity, so maybe it gets a little bit cleaner? Maybe that's optimistic of me, but what are your thoughts along some of that confusion?
Yeah, so I don't know if I've yet diagnosed who inflicts more acronyms on us, whether it's analysts like myself who partially manufacture those, or investment folks on Wall Street. Maybe it's a combination of both, and we all deserve a little bit of the blame there.
Well, or vendors.
Yeah, or vendors, right, who want to sort of make their thing distinctive. One of the things that we've introduced at Forrester, I say we, myself and Ali Mellon, who covers detection and response with me and sort of leads our SOC coverage, is one that for us from the beginning, managed detection and response included XDR. So extended detection and response was a part of it. We really feel like, EDR gives very high fidelity detections. That's being rivaled by some identity use cases now, but, EDR and identity lead to really, really high fidelity detections. But you also need to ingest and use additional data because detection is not the end point. It is not the end game, right? Detection initiates a workflow that then includes investigation and ideally includes response. And so because of that, you need to ingest more than just the endpoint. We've certainly seen this with cloud, where traditional approaches to endpoint are entirely different, right? You may not have a traditional EDR tool installed on a container, for example. And so because of that, from Forrester's perspective, we've sort of resisted terms like MXDR, managed XDR, because our definition from MDR has really included all of those things. The other thing that we've really introduced is thinking about the concept of detection and detection surface. Your detection surface is the surface upon which you can detect things, right? Be that threats, be that internal users, et cetera. And so we look at a quality MDR service or, a quality security analytics capability or XDR capability as being the one that works across various types of infrastructure, because all of those types of infrastructure are part of your detection surface, where you can use things like detection engineering to identify adversaries, where you should be able to threat hunt. So we're certainly doing our best and tilting a little bit at that windmill to resist DRing all the things, because in the last year, I think I've seen every single letter alphabetic combination of something detection and response, and then 2-letter combinations of detection and response, whether it's I've seen application security detection and response. I've seen DDR, which is not the dance game that I can't play because I'm winded after just a few seconds, but instead it's data detection and response, for example. And so we're holding firm and saying, look, detecting and responding is awesome. We love it. but we don't need to name each individual piece of infrastructure or technology and then append or add the suffix of detection and response after it, because real detection and response is comprehensive enough to cover all those inputs of a detection surface, or at least should be.
Yeah, that reminds me of some of the kinds of conversations I used to have back in my Mandiant days, where something that we was a bit of a struggle for us at the time was, look, I don't want to bifurcate by technology type because I want you to look at all of it, and I don't want to bifurcate by threat type. Please, the threats, all of them, because they all pose some kind of risk, and I shouldn't have to think about their different shapes to look, for my answers. So. Yeah, so that's an interesting take. So you talked a little bit about before some comments on where you see the MDR market going. You said it's growing, it's crowded, which I would agree with both of those statements. Any other thoughts? Like, think out maybe just a little bit further. So today it's growing, but it is crowded. Probably can't stay that way forever. Is there some time horizon, 2, 3, 5 years, where you have some thoughts on what might evolve in the space?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, consolidation is always a thing that happens, especially as you've got successful providers, very, very happy customers. One of the things that I love about MDR in general is I get to see a lot of the financial or success metrics from various vendors, right? Things like net promoter scores, wallet retention, client retention rates, and they are phenomenal in MDR. Especially for the more successful providers, those numbers are just incredible, especially for someone that's grown up in security services and knows what the old numbers were. It sort of floors me whenever I get to see them. I think we'll see some consolidation. There are very successful businesses in this space. I think we'll see some MDR providers emerge as kind of those new sort of top brands within cybersecurity for those that remain a standalone. Obviously, we can't go a call. I've got my obligatory piece of art, so this will be the obligatory generative AI mention. Because I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure this would be.
I have to take a drink.
Yeah. Oh, well, there you go. You might be unhealthy by the end of the session if you drink every time we mention it. But that's going to transform things, because that might allow our SOC analysts to spend more time investigating and detecting and writing things instead of writing tickets or writing after action reports and things like that. So there are some things there. The other thing that's currently happening to MDR, and this is actually the thing I think is most dangerous maybe within the market, is that those successful vendors that have grown are adding to their stable of services. They're adding things that they can do for clients. And that is a lot of opportunity, but it's also a lot of risk. If you're a security leader that loves your detection and response provider because it's so outcome oriented, right? They actually do things for you. One of the risks for MDR providers and customers is that the relationship sour as more services get added that aren't outcome oriented, services where maybe you can't do as much. And some vendors are currently debating things like that. So I think that's one of the other things that I'm paying a lot of attention to is, how do MDR providers keep the success going? How do they continue to scale in terms of the clients they have, which generative AI is one solution to that. I'd have to take another drink now. But then the other one is kind of what else happens with this in terms of the service portfolio. It's interesting. One of the common complaints about MDR providers, and this one's always awesome as an analyst to see come up, is I would like to buy more from them and they don't have more to sell me. And it's like, whoa, this customer really likes their vendor that much. But that's also dicey, because what if you add services that aren't as valuable? What if we go back to the day where suddenly there's a MDR vendor that decides managing firewalls is where it's at now? It's sort of like, well, is managed change control really what you want to do when you've been doing something that's so much more interesting and compelling? So that's what I'm looking for beyond consolidation and some of the technology innovation is really what are the next capabilities that MDR providers offer that they can deliver with the same sort of satisfaction levels and the same outcomes that they delivered historically across the kind of core set of detection and response capabilities. So that's one of those things I'm definitely keeping my eyes on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know it's certainly a conversation we've had. There's benefits to picking off some of those adjacencies, even if they lean outside the security buyer. But then you have a second buyer motion that you have to now deal with, and the whole thing can start to have sort of a dissonance to it, and all of a sudden people lose track of what the heck you do. So not an easy problem to solve.
No,
Okay.
and let's use one example. Like vulnerability management is a great example here, where can MDR providers give a ton of context into threats and vulnerabilities, and even validate controls and whether they can detect things? Absolutely. Also, though, often MDR providers, or I should say, often security teams, don't own patching. So once you add sort of some of that visibility, how do you help deliver that in a way that's meaningful for an IT team in the same way that it's meaningful for the security team? Or, can MDR that offers something like VRM, can you find a way to deliver the service with the right data, with the right visuals, with the right reporting, where you transform that relationship between IT and MDR in a meaningful way, where it isn't just, sort of you saying a scan ran, yes, you have vulns, they are bad, right? You should patch them, which frankly is sort of, and Eric Nost, who covers this at Forrester, says this a lot, which is sort of the state of the industry to some extent in the VRM world. It's right. It's like, we ran a scan, we found a thing. That thing is bad, definitely patch it. But if everything's urgent, nothing is urgent. And so I think those are the really interesting things, is to see if, we can approach some of these other security capabilities like VRM, email security, and other kind of detection use cases with the same sort of quality and capability that we were able to bring to detection and response, that really elevated it from just an EDR tool that said something happened to a much more comprehensive outcome-oriented service. So I think there's a lot of excitement there, but I also think there's a lot of danger there. And I think that the next round of most successful providers will be the ones that start solving those use cases in a very similar way to how they solve the detection and response use cases.
Not just reduce risk because, you have to patch it, but reduce work and cost because you have to patch this. And, and this is why. And here's sort of a tangible measurement. And these are frankly not as important. Yeah. How can your investment reduce the number of headcount in your team?
Yeah. So, and that gets us to,
or reduce the rate of growth, right?
Yes, exactly. And that gets us to the point where we're really starting to think about security posture. So it's not just, a passive service that might be based on detection and response, but we start thinking about much more proactivity and also improving customer security posture, so that as you're detecting things, you're detecting fewer of them because the posture has improved, and that makes it better for everyone.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's close out here this last little bit. Let's talk about the wave itself. So let me toss a few questions at you. The blatantly self-serving one. So you just published the wave. What stood out in this year's findings? Any sort of interesting pattern, or either for successful vendors or vendors that are struggling, without naming names, but the patterns that you may have seen, either highs and lows?
Yeah, so I think on the high side, kind of mentioned it before, but just the overall competence level of the customers buying MDR and the providers working with them, the overall satisfaction levels of those providers and their customers. Whenever you do a wave where people are less enthused, it's hard as an analyst, right? Because customers just aren't as excited about their service and what they're getting. And the MDR wave is very, very far from that. So I think that's a big one. The other things that stand out is sort of the ripple effect of automation throughout the industry. A few years ago, I started noticing a trend that automation, especially response, was becoming more and more of a topic that was popping up in MDR, and not necessarily from security leaders, but from security vendors and MDR providers. And a part of the reason why is because they really needed to scale their business. And part of that was trying to help customers, or wanting customers to start to automate more response actions. Now we're entering a period where that's starting to separate vendors from each other and providers from each other. Yeah. Some providers are starting to say that the only kind of response action we will perform is an automated response action, that we will no longer conduct a manual action on a customer's behalf. Well, not every customer is ready for automation. When you think about the ingredients that are necessary for automation, you've got to have strong situational awareness, you've got to have mature playbooks, and you've got to have expertise on what to do next and how that will impact things. If you don't have those three things, automating is sort of dangerous, right? It's kind of scary. So as providers are starting to force more of that on customers, it's starting to be a distinction between providers that are much more flexible and will work with you versus those providers that say, nope, the only way we do it is if it's automated. If it's not automated, you're on your own. So that's definitely becoming one of kind of the distinction points between providers. And then another one is also sort of the rise of federated data. We've sort of operated traditionally in security and managed detection and response in sort of an ingest model. we had the data. And that was how we did things. What we're starting to see, especially in the investigation phase, not so much in detection, but definitely in the investigation and response phase, we're starting to see the acceptance and the utilization of federated data. So being able to query data on demand without ingesting it first. Now, that's sort of an awesome development because in theory, it saves customers money because they don't have to send you all that data. It also saves providers money because you don't have to ingest and store all of that data. Mm-hmm. So definitely seeing the sort of rise of federated data becoming, a key trend, and the ability for providers to work with things beyond just what they've ingested, sort of traditionally. And then I think, kind of the last part of this is really MDR providers themselves kind of transitioning into offering, you've built a platform for experts that are great at detection and response, and starting to now offer customers access to that platform so their own teams can take advantage of it, which is sort of interesting because historically the way that services kind of worked is that you built a platform for your practitioners, and if customers wanted that, they bought it and worked with you. I think now what we're starting to see is a lot of customers that want access to those tools because those customers recognize that, hey, Expel, for example, has a bunch of really, really great SOC analysts based on the results in the Wave. Maybe I want access to Workbench, or maybe I want to do things with Workbench myself without, just relying on the SOC analyst or the practitioner to do it. So we're also starting to see kind of, purpose-built SOC platforms from providers that know how to deliver security operations, know how to deliver detection and response, starting to be a much more common thing in the enterprise and in the mid-market, sort of across sizes. So those are some of the other great trends. I'd say, the downside trend, we sort of mentioned a lot more of a focus on automation, and some of those services kind of creeping in where maybe those aren't going to create the best experiences, and customers will find themselves souring on some vendors that they loved prior to that because the adjacencies just don't quite work out the way that we expected. Those are probably the highs and lows.
Okay. And it sounds like a bunch of those are new. Like this sounds like the technology, or at least if new, maybe the idea is not new, but it's now more prevalent. Like you talked about technology platform. You talked about, it sounds like there's more people looking at those add-on services, which I don't remember. I don't think those were big themes in the 2021 report. But
they definitely weren't. That. They definitely weren't. I think the 2021 Wave, the big takeaway there was detection was what everyone was focused on. That was the thing. It was a newer service-ish. Although you can debate, when MDR started. Some vendors told me they started it in 2000, despite it never appearing on their website. But I think it happened a little bit after that, just personally. But detection was really the big emphasis in that Wave. Even response wasn't as important because organizations weren't as ready to do things like automate, for example. So in this Wave, I think a lot of the focus was on what's next, what are the innovations around MDR itself, what are the innovations in the platforms, as well as what does response look like. Those were definitely the themes that were really, really different in comparison to, say, 18 months ago, 2 years ago, when it was much more about we're looking for someone that can detect better than we can. That's sort of now table stakes, and now it's about those other capabilities.
Okay, well, that makes sense. Let's see it. Well, let's close with this one. So you've got a number of demo scenarios that participating vendors we have to work with, and can you talk about maybe why some are in there? Like maybe you could pick one or two sort of specific examples, like we picked this because this and this because that, and maybe some color on how common is that something where as you're dealing with buyers are things that are on their mind or things that they've seen?
Yeah, so I think, when I look at the demo scenarios, it's something that I love in every Wave. And I often work with clients with those and say, hey, this could even be proof of concept, potential success criteria. How do they handle these particular events? So a couple that I really love, there were 4 demo scenarios in this one, a couple that I really love. So one, the cloud token theft scenario, which has been all over the place, right? Because we know that cloud token theft has been such a common, attack vehicle for threat actors, and also business email compromise and fraudulent funds transfer. I was at the Cyber Insurance Micro Summit at Black Hat And the rise of FFT in particular is one that cyber insurers are dealing with, that businesses are dealing with. Very difficult sometimes to claw back funds unless you catch it right away. It's such an important vector. And honestly, it's 2023, right? If all I cared about in the wave is asking you about, I don't know, APT1 yet again, I just don't know that it would have been that interesting, right? Like, yeah, look, don't get me wrong, phishing still matters, right? Identifying the adversary then, tracking them down, all that stuff matters. But again, that's sort of table stakes. Like a good MDR provider ought to just blow that away. In fact, in a lot of cases, technology can help us do a lot of that. But what about these other things like cloud token theft, where the infrastructure we have, the aperture we have is really different, where, you have to deal with cloud APIs, you've got gaps in visibility, and you've also got increases in visibility over on-prem because cloud brings some advantages too. And then business email compromise and fraudulent funds transfer, those are massively impactful to organizations directly and financially. And so I thought those would be interesting to sort of, evaluate in the wave to really kind of move us past that standard scenario of detect the threat actor that sends the phishing email still important, but the entirety of our security stack and the entirety of our tech estate is well beyond that now. And security teams are just as responsible for detecting and responding in cloud as they are on a laptop. And so it's really important that we start to incorporate those into use cases, into scenarios. And that's why ultimately I picked them in my demo scenarios, because those are ones that, security leaders, as I talk to them, are starting to really worry about. Like, hey, I feel pretty good about what happens on laptops. I'm really worried about what happens with cloud tokens and APIs in the cloud, because there just isn't the level of visibility there.
Yeah, no, that definitely resonates. And I know that we see that behavior from a cloud perspective and end up, dealing with those issues for customers. And then the funds transfer one I thought was interesting because one of the more creative ones we saw was change direct deposit information for individual employees for the paychecks in Workday, which I thought was like, oh, well, that's terrible.
I mean, but amazing, right? It's like one of those things where it's like, of course you can do that. I wouldn't think of it, but we talk about, kind of one reason why ransomware is so prominent and prevalent is because it's a direct monetization of, an attack. Well, so is FFT. It's direct monetization. And in some cases, depending on how rapid the adversary moves, it's also one of the ones that's most difficult to claw anything back from, right? Because you've got banks involved and, cash might be transferred to another institution after this one. And so it's a really rapid sort of attack vehicle. And I know from talking to cyber insurers, Heidi Shea and Jess Byrne, who I work with quite a bit, talk to them. And one of their top of the sort of radar issues right now is fraudulent funds transfer. And they're seeing things like, you get into an environment, you add a mailbox to the server, you collect all those invoices, you start changing a line here or there, and it goes to your account versus someone else's. And it's that simple. And it's just not detected until, 5 days later, a vendor says, hey, wait, you said you were going to pay us and you didn't. And by then the money's gone. Yeah, it's gone. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's definitely something that we've seen. Interesting. I'm going to try a closing statement, just an observation. I'd like you to react to it.
Sure.
And so, in that last talk track in particular, it sounds like some thematics there are the attack surface is continuing to evolve and change, like it is not static. And you gave some specific examples, and then we could get all science fiction-y where nobody's sure what to do about this now. But what about language model drift and whatever the next thing is, someone's going to figure out how to manipulate to their advantage, where you need to identify the manipulation in order to remediate it. It feels like that attack surface evolution continues to accelerate, not decelerate. And so it seems like there's some strategic advantage if you can find the right partner to help you stay on the right end of that, because keeping up just shoveling yourself sounds pretty challenging. But I mean, I'm the vendor making a self-serving statement about MDR. I'm just curious how you think about that, whether you think that's sort of an accurate assessment of, okay, yeah, this is the strategic benefit this market needs to provide because of that kind of dynamic. So I'll shut up and let you swat that down or add to it and or refine it.
So I'll add to it. I think you're right. Our attack surface keeps expanding, and the technologies that that create that attack surface keep expanding as well. Deep fakes and, synthetic content, and what does that look like, and how's that going to change things, and how's it an entry point for fraud, for example, and identity issues and things like that. And as such, your detection surface needs to expand as well. And I think that, if you take the average security team, it is very, very difficult to develop mastery on a set of tools given all of the tools that a team needs to use. And that's where working with a partner, someone that can take that detection surface into account, look at tools out there, have the right partnerships, do the right research, and really stays focused on detection, investigation, and response, for example, that's what teams need. I talk to look ahead folks on security teams all the time, and even folks that have a research role, right? Their entire job is looking at what's coming next from the vendor world, what's coming next from the adversary world. Even they're crushed under all of the things that have been happening just since September of last year, when ChatGPT entered the fold. And so as they're struggling to keep up with that, and they hand that back to their internal teams, there's just a real challenge at keeping up with all of this. And we know that threat actors will exploit it when they have to. The issue right now is the reason why a whole bunch of threat actors don't need to install large language models and train them is because phishing emails still work. Like, they don't need a better phishing email. They're still pretty effective. But as soon as, once we get better at that, we know it will increase. And that's where I think being able to really sort of, allocate your resources in the way that makes the most sense for you as a leader, that's where services comes in and helps out. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't mean you outsource, because that's the old model. Instead, the right services partnerships are about resource allocation. You have a partner you depend on to find things so that your team can contextualize that for your own environment, or can spend time thinking about the science fiction stuff that isn't as real right now, if that's what you need. And that's what a strong services partnership really brings to them. And that's part of why I love MDR and what it brings to customers.
Excellent. Fantastic. Well, Jeff, we sure do appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today, and for everybody getting a chance to see this. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you all again sometime soon. Cheers, everybody.